47 men were dying in darkness, forgotten by both armies. Above them, the battle raged. Below, in a collapsed bunker on Okinawa, starvation was winning the war that bullets couldn't finish. Then, a single American soldier made a choice his comrades called stupid. A choice that would save every life in that cave and challenge everything they thought they knew about enemies, loyalty, and what it truly means to be human. Spring 1945 brought hell to Okinawa. The island had become a graveyard dressed in smoke and shattered coral, where every ridge hid another nightmare, and every cave system concealed desperate men willing to die for an empire that had already lost. The Battle of Okinawa wasn't just the last major campaign of the Pacific War. It was the bloodiest, most brutal culmination of 4 years of savagery that had stripped away any pretense of civilized warfare. By April, when American forces stormed the beaches, both sides understood that mercy had become a casualty long before the first shot was fired. Technical Sergeant Frank Hachia moved through the ruins near Shuri Castle with the cautious steps of a man who had learned to trust nothing. At 24 years old, he carried an M1 Garand rifle, a translator's notebook, and the impossible weight of 2 identities that should never have existed in the same body. His face was Japanese. His uniform was American. And in the spring of 1945, that contradiction could get you killed by either side. Frank was Nisei, second generation, born on American soil to immigrant parents who had crossed the Pacific chasing the promise that hard work and loyalty would earn them a place in their new country. That promise had shattered on December 7, 1941, when Japanese planes turned Pearl Harbor into an inferno, and suddenly every face like Frank's became suspect. Within months, Executive Order 9066 had torn his family from their California farm and deposited them behind barbed wire in Manzanar, one of 10 internment camps scattered across America's desert interior, where 120,000 Japanese Americans discovered that citizenship meant nothing when fear took the wheel. Frank had volunteered anyway. When the Army finally decided that Nisei soldiers might be useful after all, he'd signed up for the Military Intelligence Service, not because he believed America had treated his people fairly, but because he needed to prove something that shouldn't have required proof, that his loyalty belonged to the country of his birth, not the country of his ancestors' graves. Now he was here, translating intercepted communications and interrogating the rare Japanese soldier who chose capture over suicide, trying to extract intelligence from men who looked like his uncles, while his own family rotted in a camp thousands of miles away. The irony was so sharp it could draw blood. The cave system near the collapsed section of Shuri's defensive line hadn't been marked on any map. Frank's unit had stumbled across it during a sweep for stragglers, expecting to find either nothing or a final desperate ambush. What they found instead made even the battle-hardened veterans stop cold. 47 Japanese soldiers lay in the darkness of the underground bunker, so skeletal that their uniforms hung like shrouds on frames that barely qualified as human anymore. Some were unconscious. Others stared with the hollow eyes of men who had already made peace with death and were simply waiting for it to arrive. The stench of dysentery, infection, and slow starvation filled the confined space like a physical presence. They had been cut off from their unit during the American advance, trapped when artillery fire collapsed the main entrance to their position. For 6 days they had survived on nothing but the last handful of rice and whatever water seeped through the cave walls. Their officer, a lieutenant who couldn't have been older than 22, had maintained discipline even as his men wasted away. They had not surrendered. They had not fled. They had simply endured until endurance became impossible. Frank knelt at the entrance to the cave, his rifle still ready but his finger carefully away from the trigger. Behind him, Sergeant Miller spat tobacco juice onto the shattered coral and muttered something that didn't need translation. The other soldiers in the squad kept their distance, watching Frank with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. Everyone knew what Hachia was, a translator, useful but not quite trustworthy, American by paperwork but Japanese by blood. "Tell them to come out," Miller ordered. "Hands up, no weapons," the usual. Frank called out in Japanese, his voice carrying into the darkness with words he'd learned at his mother's knee, words that now felt like weapons turned against their source. The response came slowly, weak voices conferring in the shadows. Then the lieutenant appeared, crawling more than walking, his hands empty and raised. What happened next would be recorded in no official history. The reports would note that 47 enemy prisoners were taken near Shuri on May 3, 1945, and processed according to standard procedure. The documents would show that all prisoners survived to reach the POW camps on Hawaii and the mainland. But the reports would never mention the choice one Nisei sergeant made in those first few minutes, a choice that his fellow soldiers called stupid, dangerous, and perhaps even treasonous. Frank looked at those 47 faces and saw his father. He saw his younger brother who had volunteered for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and was fighting in Italy while their family lived behind barbed wire. He saw every farmer and shopkeeper and fisherman who had come to America believing in a promise that turned out to be conditional, subject to change whenever fear outweighed principle. But more than that, he saw human beings who were dying not from wounds or honor or tactical necessity, but from simple abandonment. And something in him, something that years of discrimination and war and carefully controlled rage hadn't quite killed, refused to look away. The protocol was clear enough. Enemy prisoners were to be searched, secured, and transported to the rear for interrogation. They would receive medical attention if necessary, food and water according to Geneva Convention standards, and treatment that distinguished American forces from the atrocities committed by the Imperial Japanese Army. On paper, the United States was fighting a civilized war. In reality, after 4 years of propaganda depicting Japanese soldiers as subhuman savages, after stories of the Bataan Death March and the rape of Nanking, after watching friends die screaming on beaches and in jungles, most American soldiers considered a dead Japanese soldier the only acceptable kind. Taking prisoners in the Pacific Theater was rare. The Bushido Code made surrender shameful beyond comprehension, and most Japanese soldiers chose death over the dishonor of capture. By 1945, the United States held only about 5,000 Japanese POWs compared to over 400,000 Germans. Those who did surrender often faced suspicion, harsh treatment, and sometimes violence from captors who saw them as cowards, unworthy of the mercy they'd never shown to Allied prisoners. Frank understood all of this. He'd heard the stories, read the intelligence reports, seen photographs of atrocities that made his stomach turn. He knew that showing compassion to Japanese soldiers could mark him as a traitor to men who already questioned his loyalty. His own government had imprisoned his family for the crime of having Japanese faces. Some of his fellow soldiers would happily shoot him if they thought he was choosing blood over country. But he also understood something that most of the men in his unit couldn't grasp, because they'd never lived between two worlds that were simultaneously home and hostile territory. He understood that humanity wasn't something you could turn on and off based on which uniform someone wore. He understood that the moment you stopped seeing enemies as human beings, you became the monster you were supposed to be fighting. So Frank made his choice. He unstrapped his canteen, heavy with the clean water that had been trucked up to the front lines that morning, and handed it to the Japanese lieutenant. The man stared at him, confusion and suspicion and desperate thirst warring in his expression. Then he drank, careful, measured sips that spoke of discipline even in extremity. "Sergeant, what the hell are you doing?" Miller's voice carried the edge of genuine anger. "We've got orders to secure prisoners, not nurse them. They can't walk, Sergeant. 3 of them look like they'll be dead in an hour if they don't get fluids and food." Frank kept his voice level, professional, the tone of a man stating tactical facts rather than making an emotional appeal. Dead prisoners can't be interrogated. Command needs intelligence. It was a calculated argument, framing compassion as military necessity. Miller stared at him for a long moment, working tobacco around his mouth while he considered whether to press the issue. Finally, he shrugged. "Your career, Hachiya. You want to play nursemaid to Japs? That's on you. But if any of them try anything, I'm shooting you first for being stupid enough to get close." Frank nodded, accepting the terms. He turned back to the prisoners and began distributing his K-rations, the compact packages of crackers, canned meat, and chocolate that made up the American soldier's field diet. It wasn't much. His daily allotment divided among 47 starving men, but it was something. The prisoners accepted the food with trembling hands, some too weak to open the cans until Frank helped them. One of the Japanese soldiers was barely 19, with a boy's smooth face above a body reduced to sticks wrapped in skin. He reminded Frank painfully of his younger brother Tommy, who had joined the 442nd despite everything their family had endured, determined to prove that Nisei blood ran red, white and blue, even when America doubted it. This boy soldier had probably been conscripted, pulled from a farm or factory and handed a rifle with minimal training, told that dying for the emperor was the highest honor a man could achieve. "Where are you from?" Frank asked in Japanese, his voice gentle. The boy looked up, startled that an American soldier spoke his language. "Hiroshima," he whispered. "My father has a bicycle shop. I was supposed to take over when—" His voice broke. He didn't need to finish. They both knew there might be nothing to take over, no shop or father or city left standing when this war finally ground to its bloody conclusion. Another prisoner, older, maybe 40, had the weathered hands of a farmer. He watched Frank with eyes that held both gratitude and shame, the complex emotion of a man whose culture told him that accepting help from an enemy was dishonorable, but whose body was too broken to refuse the mercy being offered. "Why?" the farmer asked. "Why do you help us?" Frank didn't have a simple answer. How could he explain that he was helping them precisely because America had taught him what it felt like to be judged by ancestry rather than actions? How could he articulate that maintaining his own humanity required him to recognize theirs, especially, when they were enemies? "Because you're human beings who are starving," Frank said finally. "That's reason enough." The response seemed to confuse the farmer even more. In his world, enemies were obstacles to be destroyed, not people deserving of compassion. The entire machinery of modern warfare depended on dehumanization, on training soldiers to see opposing forces as targets, rather than fathers and sons and brothers. Frank's simple act of recognizing their humanity threatened that carefully constructed mental framework. Word spread quickly through the unit about what Hachia was doing. Reactions ranged from disgust to grudging respect to carefully maintained neutrality. Corporal Jackson, an African-American medic who understood something about being judged by characteristics you couldn't control, quietly passed Frank extra bandages and sulfa powder for treating the prisoner's infected wounds. Private O'Brien, whose brother had died in the Bataan Death March, refused to come within 50 feet of the cave and made his hatred clear with looks that promised violence if Frank stepped out of line. The worst came from Lieutenant Morrison, the company commander, who showed up an hour after the prisoners were secured. Morrison was a West Point graduate, career military, the kind of officer who believed in regulations and chain of command with religious fervor. He found Frank distributing water and medical supplies to prisoners who should have been left to cope with whatever standard processing provided. "Sergeant Hachia, a word, now." Frank stood, came to attention, and followed Morrison out of earshot of the other soldiers. He knew what was coming. He'd known it from the moment he handed over his canteen. "Do you want to explain why you're using your personal rations to feed enemy combatants? Why you're distributing medical supplies without authorization? Why you're treating these men like they're wounded friendlies instead of prisoners who'd slit your throat if they had the strength?" "Sir, 3 of those men were in immediate danger of death from dehydration and starvation. Dead prisoners provide no intelligence value. I made a tactical decision to preserve assets for interrogation." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Don't play games with me, Sergeant. I know what you're doing and I know why. You see your own face in theirs and you're letting that cloud your judgment. These men are enemy soldiers. They've killed Americans. Some of them probably participated in atrocities that would make you sick if you knew the details. And you're feeding them chocolate like they're lost children. Sir, with respect, they are starving. The Geneva Convention requires adequate treatment, which they'll receive at the POW processing center. It doesn't require you to sacrifice your own supplies to nurse them. It doesn't require you to risk disciplinary action by overstepping your authority." Morrison stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, Hachia. I know your situation is complicated. I know what happened to your family, but you're wearing that uniform, which means you follow orders and maintain perspective. Your loyalty is to the United States Army, not to anyone who happens to share your ancestors' bloodline." The words stung because they came close to truth while missing it entirely. Frank's loyalty was to the United States, or at least to the idea of what the United States claimed to be, the promise of equality and justice that his parents had believed in. But that loyalty didn't require him to abandon his humanity. It didn't demand that he become the kind of person who could watch other human beings die of neglect and call it military necessity. "I understand, sir, but I respectfully maintain that my actions serve the mission. These prisoners are now calm, cooperative, and will likely provide useful intelligence specifically because they've been shown that American forces follow civilized standards. Brutality breeds resistance. Compassion can generate cooperation. It was a calculated argument, wrapping ethics in strategic language. Morrison studied him for a long moment, clearly wrestling with whether to push the issue further. Finally, he nodded. Fine. You've made your tactical decision, Sergeant, but understand that this goes in my report. If anything goes wrong, if even one of these prisoners tries anything, if your actions compromise this unit's security in any way, you'll face formal charges. Am I clear? Crystal clear, sir. Morrison walked away, and Frank returned to the cave where 47 enemy soldiers were slowly returning to the world of the living. He knew he'd probably just destroyed any chance of promotion, marked himself permanently as a security risk, and confirmed every suspicion that Nisei soldiers couldn't be fully trusted. But when he looked at those 47 faces and saw gratitude instead of hatred, recognition instead of fear, he couldn't bring himself to regret the choice. The broader context of what Frank had done couldn't be separated from the larger story of Japanese Americans during World War II. When President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, he authorized the forced removal and incarceration of every person of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast, citizen and non-citizen alike. Within months, 120,000 people were torn from their homes, businesses, and communities. They were allowed to bring only what they could carry. Everything else, houses, farms, businesses built over decades, was lost, sold at predatory prices, or simply seized. The camps that became their prisons were located in desolate areas: Manzanar in the California desert, Tule Lake near the Oregon border, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, and 7 others scattered across America's interior. They were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers manned by soldiers with orders to shoot anyone who tried to escape. Families lived in tar paper barracks with no privacy, ate in communal mess halls, and used shared bathroom facilities. The government called them relocation centers. Everyone else recognized them for what they were: concentration camps built not because of anything people had done, but because of who they were. In the midst of this betrayal, the United States government made an extraordinary request. It asked the same people it had imprisoned to volunteer to fight and die for the country that had denied their fundamental rights. The formation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in 1943 gave Japanese Americans a chance to prove their loyalty through blood. Thousands volunteered. Some came directly from the camps, enlisting behind barbed wire. Others, like Frank's younger brother Tommy, joined despite watching their families lose everything. Their reasoning was complex: patriotism mixed with anger, a desire to prove themselves, and the desperate hope that military service might demonstrate once and for all that American citizenship meant something more than paperwork. The 442nd became the most decorated unit in United States military history. Fighting in Italy and France, these Nisei soldiers earned 9,586 Purple Hearts, 21 Medals of Honor, and suffered a 314% casualty rate, meaning the unit had to be replaced more than 3 times over due to deaths and wounds. They liberated towns, rescued the lost battalion, and fought with a ferocity that came from having everything to prove and nothing left to lose. But their heroism came at a cost that couldn't be measured in medals. They fought while their families remained imprisoned. They died defending a country that had declared them enemy aliens. And when the war ended, many returned to find their homes gone, their property seized, and discrimination waiting to welcome them back to the America they'd bled for. Frank had chosen a different path. Instead of joining the 442nd, he'd enlisted in the Military Intelligence Service, where his Japanese language skills made him invaluable. The MIS was even more secretive than the combat units. Their work remained classified for decades after the war ended. Nisei linguists translated captured documents, interrogated prisoners, intercepted radio communications, and provided cultural insights that helped American forces understand an enemy whose mindset seemed incomprehensible to most Western observers. About 6,000 Nisei served in the MIS during the Pacific War. They were present at every major campaign: Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and eventually the occupation of Japan itself. Their contributions saved countless American lives by providing intelligence that shaped tactical decisions. But their service came with unique dangers. If captured by Japanese forces, Nisei soldiers faced almost certain execution as traitors. On the American side, they faced constant suspicion from fellow soldiers who couldn't separate them from the enemy they were fighting. Frank lived this contradiction every day. He wore the uniform and followed orders, but he also carried the knowledge that his government considered his own family a threat requiring imprisonment. He interrogated Japanese prisoners while wondering if the same thing might happen to him if he said the wrong thing or showed too much sympathy. And now, by choosing to show compassion to starving enemy soldiers, he'd confirmed every fear that Nisei loyalty might be divided. The 47 prisoners were transported to a temporary holding area that evening, then moved to a formal POW processing center on Okinawa's southern coast. Frank accompanied them as translator, watching as they were photographed, fingerprinted, and documented. The transformation was already visible. Men who had been skeletal wraiths that morning now had a bit more strength, enough to walk without collapsing, enough to answer questions during preliminary interrogation. The young soldier from Hiroshima, the one who reminded Frank of his brother, was processed as Private Nakamura. During interrogation, he provided information about his unit's disposition, command structure, and the general state of morale among Japanese forces on Okinawa. He answered questions readily, without the resistance that often characterized prisoner interrogations. When asked why he was being cooperative, Nakamura said something that would stay with Frank for the rest of his life. The American sergeant who gave us water spoke to us like we were human. If America has soldiers like that, perhaps the propaganda we were told was not true. Perhaps surrender is not the end of honor. That single statement, recorded in Frank's translation notes, encapsulated why his stupid act of compassion had strategic value beyond the immediate humanitarian impact. By treating enemy soldiers with basic human decency, he'd begun to undermine the psychological conditioning that made Japanese forces fight to the death. He'd demonstrated that American values weren't just propaganda, that there was a meaningful difference between the forces they were facing and the brutal caricatures imperial propaganda had painted. Other prisoners echoed similar sentiments. The farmer from Hiroshima said he'd been told that Americans tortured and executed prisoners, that surrender meant being worked to death in mines or factories. Instead, he'd been given food, water, and medical treatment by a man who looked Japanese, but acted with a compassion that contradicted everything he'd been taught about the enemy. The intelligence officers processing the prisoners quickly recognized the value of what Frank had done. Captain Williams, who ran interrogation operations for the division, called Frank into his tent 3 days after the prisoners were secured. "Sergeant Hachia, I've been reviewing the interrogation reports from those 47 prisoners you brought in. Do you know what the cooperation rate is?" "No, sir." 100%. Every single one of them has provided useful information. No resistance, no adherence to name, rank, and serial number only, no attempts at deception. That's almost unheard of with Japanese POWs. Williams leaned back in his chair, studying Frank with an expression that was hard to read. "Lieutenant Morrison wrote you up for improper distribution of supplies and overstepping your authority. But from an intelligence perspective, what you did was brilliant. You broke down their resistance before we even started formal questioning. So, I'm adding a commendation to your file for exceptional tactical judgment." Frank didn't know what to say. He hadn't been thinking about interrogation value when he'd shared his rations. He'd simply been unable to watch human beings starve when he had the power to prevent it. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing what seemed right." "What seemed right?" Williams repeated. "That's an interesting phrase, Sergeant. In war, right and wrong get complicated. But I'll tell you something. Those prisoners are going to be shipped to camps on the mainland. They'll spend the rest of the war there, probably work in agriculture or factories, and when it's over, they'll go home. 47 men who would have died in that cave are going to survive because you made a choice that wasn't required by any regulation or order. That's worth noting. The commendation didn't erase the reprimand." Frank's personnel file now contained both a permanent record of the contradiction he embodied, praised for tactical success, while being disciplined for the compassion that made that success possible. It was a fitting symbol for the impossible position Nisei soldiers occupied, simultaneously valued and suspected, American and foreign, loyal and questionable. The Battle of Okinawa continued until June 21, 1945. When it finally ended, the casualties were staggering. Over 12,000 American dead, 38,000 wounded, and tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians killed. The island that was supposed to be a stepping stone to the Japanese mainland instead became a preview of how costly an invasion would be, helping to shape the decision to use atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. Frank was still on Okinawa when news of the atomic bombings reached the troops. The young prisoner, Private Nakamura from Hiroshima, was already on a ship to Hawaii by then. Frank wondered if the boy's father and his bicycle shop had survived, or if they'd been vaporized in the flash that turned 100,000 human beings into shadows and ash. The moral mathematics of war had always been brutal: save American lives by killing Japanese civilians, end the war quickly by unleashing destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's radio address, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard his voice, announced that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, a masterpiece of understatement that couldn't hide the reality of total defeat. For the 47 prisoners Frank had saved, the news came in POW camps scattered across the American mainland. They were among the lucky ones, alive, relatively healthy, and slated for eventual repatriation rather than execution or permanent imprisonment. The Nisei soldiers who had fought so hard to prove their loyalty came home to a country that still didn't quite trust them. The internment camps closed, but Japanese Americans returning to the West Coast found their homes occupied by others, their businesses destroyed, and discrimination that had merely been paused, not eliminated. The 4 on 42nd received a hero's welcome in Washington, D.C., with President Truman personally greeting them. But individual soldiers found that medals didn't open doors or change minds when they tried to buy houses in white neighborhoods or apply for jobs with suspicious employers. Frank returned to California in early 1946 after spending months as part of the occupation force in Japan. He found his family's farm sold to cover unpaid taxes that had accumulated while they were imprisoned. His parents were living in a cramped apartment in Los Angeles, trying to rebuild from nothing. His brother Tommy had died in Italy, killed during the 432nd's push through the Gothic Line, one of the thousands of Nisei soldiers who gave everything for a country that gave them so little in return. The years passed. Frank didn't talk about the war much, and he especially didn't mention the 47 prisoners. It wasn't the kind of story that made sense to most people. Why would you help enemy soldiers when your own family had been imprisoned, when your brother had been killed fighting Japan? The nuance was too complex, the moral territory too ambiguous. So Frank stayed quiet, worked as a translator for the occupation government, eventually returned to the United States and became a teacher, and let the story fade into the vast collection of untold moments that make up any life. But the story didn't end there. In 1952, 7 years after the war's end, the United States Army received an unusual letter from Japan. It was written in careful English by a man named Nakamura Kenji, formerly Private Nakamura of the Imperial Japanese Army. He was looking for an American soldier, a sergeant who spoke Japanese and had given water and food to prisoners near Shuri Castle on Okinawa in May of 1945. Nakamura wanted to thank him. He wanted the sergeant to know that his father's bicycle shop had survived, that he had rebuilt his life, and that he would never forget the moment when an enemy soldier chose compassion over hatred. The letter eventually found its way to Frank through a combination of military bureaucracy and luck. He wrote back a brief message saying he was glad Nakamura had survived and rebuilt. That could have been the end of it. But Nakamura shared Frank's letter with other survivors from that cave, and soon more letters arrived. The farmer wrote about returning to his fields. A former teacher described rebuilding his school. A merchant talked about his children, born after the war, growing up in a Japan that was slowly transforming from defeated enemy to American ally. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, a group of survivors from those 47 prisoners pooled their resources to place a small memorial stone near the site where they'd been captured. The inscription, in both Japanese and English, read, "In memory of compassion that transcends war, may we never forget that our enemies were also human." They invited Frank to the dedication. He was 64 years old by then, retired, widowed, living quietly in California. He almost didn't go. The thought of returning to Okinawa, to the island where he'd seen so much death and made a choice that had defined him in ways both good and complicated, filled him with emotions he couldn't quite name. But he went. And when he stood before that memorial stone surrounded by elderly Japanese men who bowed deeply and wept as they thanked him for their lives, Frank finally understood what his stupid act of compassion had really meant. It wasn't about military intelligence or tactical advantage. It wasn't even about saving 47 lives, though that alone would have been enough. It was about refusing to let war turn him into something less than human. It was about maintaining the values he'd been fighting for especially when, maintaining those values was difficult and dangerous. It was about proving that American ideals weren't just propaganda, that the promise of equality and justice and human dignity could mean something real even in the darkest circumstances. One of the survivors, the farmer who had asked why Frank helped them, spoke at the dedication. His English was halting but clear. That American sergeant taught me that honor is not found in death, but in how we treat each other when death is easy and mercy is hard. He was enemy, but he was also human being who saw human beings. This is lesson I teach my children and grandchildren. This is why we build this stone. Frank didn't give a speech. He simply stood there, an old man among other old men, all of them survivors of a war that had tried to destroy their humanity and failed. He thought about his brother Tommy, who had died proving his loyalty. He thought about his parents, who had lost everything because America forgot its own principles. He thought about all the Nisei soldiers who had fought so hard for recognition that came too slowly and meant too little. And he thought about the choice he'd made in a cave on Okinawa, when doing the right thing had been called stupid, dangerous, and possibly treasonous. He'd been reprimanded and commended, disciplined and decorated, all for the same act. That contradiction had defined his service, and in many ways it had defined the entire Nisei experience during World War II, fighting for a country that imprisoned them, proving loyalty to a government that questioned it, and maintaining honor in circumstances designed to strip it away. The legacy of the Nisei soldiers slowly gained recognition over the decades following the war. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which apologized for the internment and provided token reparations to survivors. In 2000, President Bill Clinton awarded Medals of Honor to 21 Asian American soldiers, including several from the 442nd, whose heroism had been overlooked due to racial prejudice. In 2011, the 442nd and the Military Intelligence Service received the Congressional Gold Medal, Congress's highest civilian honor. But these official recognitions, important as they were, couldn't capture the thousands of individual stories of courage, sacrifice, and humanity that characterized the Nisei experience. They couldn't describe what it felt like to fight for a country that had betrayed you. They couldn't explain the impossible choice between proving loyalty and maintaining dignity. And they couldn't fully convey the significance of small acts of compassion performed in circumstances where compassion was considered weakness. Frank's story represents just one of those thousands of untold moments. He wasn't the only Nisei soldier who showed compassion to Japanese prisoners. Many others did the same, risking censure and violence to maintain their humanity in dehumanizing circumstances. He wasn't unique in facing the contradiction of being both American and perpetually foreign. And he wasn't alone in making choices that were strategically sound, but culturally complicated. What makes his story worth telling is precisely that it represents a larger truth about war, identity, and humanity. In any conflict, there are moments when individuals must choose between following the crowd into hatred or standing alone for something better. There are times when the right choice is also the dangerous choice, when compassion requires courage, and when maintaining your values costs more than abandoning them. Frank's fellow soldiers called his compassion stupid because they couldn't see past the immediate context of war. They saw enemy soldiers who deserved no mercy. They saw a Nisei who might be compromised by ethnic loyalty. They saw supplies being wasted on men who would have gladly killed them in different circumstances. What they couldn't see was that Frank's choice was actually the smartest thing he could have done, not for tactical reasons, though those proved real enough, but because it allowed him to remain the person he wanted to be, despite the circumstances trying to force him into something else. The question that haunted Frank throughout his life, and that haunts this story, is simple but profound. What separates civilization from barbarism? It's not weapons or technology or political systems. It's the choice to recognize humanity in others even when everything around you insists they're less than human. It's the decision to show mercy when revenge would be easier. It's the courage to maintain your values precisely when maintaining them is most difficult. World War II forced that question on millions of people. Some answered it by embracing hatred, by treating enemies as vermin to be exterminated without thought or mercy. Others, like Frank and the thousands of Nisei soldiers who served despite betrayal, answered it by proving that honor and humanity could survive even total war. The 47 prisoners Frank saved went home to rebuild their lives in a devastated Japan. Most lived quiet, ordinary existences, raising families, working jobs, participating in the miracle of Japan's post-war recovery. They weren't heroes or villains, just men who had survived because one person chose compassion over hatred. That choice rippled forward through their lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren, all of whom existed because Frank had been willing to risk his career and possibly his life to share water with dying enemies. Frank himself lived to see the full transformation of Japanese Americans from suspected enemies to recognized citizens. He watched as the next generations, no longer burdened by the same discrimination and suspicion, built successful lives without the contradictions that had defined his existence. He saw the 402nd finally receive the recognition they deserved. And he witnessed the slow, painful process of America acknowledging that the internment had been a profound betrayal of its own principles. He died in 1994, at age 73, having lived long enough to see both recognition and reconciliation. His obituary mentioned his military service and his career as an educator, but it said nothing about the 47 prisoners or the choice that had defined his war. That story remained private, shared only with family and the Japanese survivors who had kept his memory alive across the Pacific. But the story deserves to be remembered, precisely because it's not about conventional heroism. Frank didn't charge enemy positions or single-handedly defeat overwhelming odds. He didn't perform the kind of dramatic feat that earns medals and inspires movies. Instead, he did something harder. He maintained his humanity when the entire machinery of war was designed to strip it away. He chose compassion when hatred would have been easier and safer. He recognized that the men dying in that cave were human beings first and enemy soldiers second. That choice, replicated across countless individual moments by countless individuals, is what prevents war from becoming absolute barbarism. It's what allows soldiers to remain human, despite being trained to kill. It's what makes reconciliation possible after conflicts end. And it's what gives meaning to phrases like honor and dignity that otherwise risk becoming empty propaganda. For the men and women who lived through World War II, these questions weren't abstract philosophy. They were immediate, practical dilemmas with life and death consequences. The Nisei soldiers faced them in particularly acute form, forced to navigate between two identities that the war had placed in opposition. But every soldier, on every side, eventually confronted the choice between maintaining their humanity or surrendering to the dehumanizing logic of total war. Frank made his choice in a cave on Okinawa, and 47 men survived because of it. That's the simple, factual legacy. But the deeper legacy is the reminder that compassion isn't weakness, that recognizing your enemy's humanity doesn't betray your own side, and that the truest form of courage is sometimes the willingness to be called stupid for doing what's right. The memorial stone still stands near Shuri Castle, though few visitors understand its significance. The cave where the prisoners were trapped has been sealed for safety, but local historians know the story. In Japan, among the families of those 47 survivors, Frank's name is still spoken with reverence. And in the archives of the Military Intelligence Service, buried among thousands of pages of classified documents that were finally declassified decades after the war, there's a brief notation about a Nisei sergeant who saved 47 enemy prisoners and earned both a reprimand and a commendation for the same act. That contradiction, praised and punished, decorated and disciplined, trusted and suspected, captures the essence of the Nisei experience during World War II. And it reminds us that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when individuals must choose between the easy path of hatred and the difficult path of compassion, between surrendering to war's logic or maintaining the values that make us human. Frank chose compassion. He called it stupid himself sometimes, acknowledging the risks and the costs. But he never regretted it. And 47 men who should have died in darkness instead lived to see their homes again, to rebuild their lives, and to teach their children and grandchildren that even in war, even between enemies, humanity can prevail if individuals are willing to pay the price for maintaining it. That's the story of how one U.S. Nisei soldier's stupid compassion saved 47 Japanese POWs from starvation. It's a story about war and identity, about loyalty and humanity, about the impossible choices that define us when circumstances try to reduce us to something less than we are. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, not because it's unique, many others made similar choices, but because it represents a truth that every generation needs to relearn, that our greatest strength lies not in our capacity for destruction, but in our willingness to show mercy when mercy is hardest, to recognize humanity when everything tells us to look away, and to choose compassion even when the world calls us stupid for doing so. If this story of courage and compassion moved you, help us share it with others who need to hear it. Hit that subscribe button to join our community exploring the untold stories of history, the moments of humanity that textbooks often forget. Your like tells the algorithm that these stories matter, helping us reach more people who value history's deeper lessons. And here's my question for you. Have you ever made a choice that others called stupid but you knew was right? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear about the moments when you chose compassion over convenience, humanity over hatred. Remember, Frank Hachia's legacy lives on not in monuments or medals, but in the conversations we have about what it means to remain human when the world tells us to be something else. By engaging with this content, you're keeping that conversation alive. Subscribe, like, and comment, not just for the algorithm, but because these stories deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.